Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you all had a great long weekend, but today's case is not only going to be an important one, but it is going to be a very hard one to talk about and listen to. So just keep that in mind. On August 1st of this year, 45-year-old Johnny Johnson was executed via lethal injection and was pronounced dead at 6:33 p.m. Now, Johnny's face came across my screen a few weeks ago, and I've been waiting to see what was going to happen in his case. But now that we have a conclusion, I wanted to talk about the reason this evil man was put to death and the beautiful little girl that he took away from this earth. Again, this is going to be a really tough one, so keep that in mind. But I think there's a lot we can learn from this case, and I think this case can be a warning to parents about who you let around your children. Cassandra Lynn Williamson, who went by Casey, was born on November 23rd of 1995, which is really hard for me to say knowing that she was born the same year that I was, and she would be turning 28 soon, just like I did this year, but unfortunately, Casey never will be. Casey was born to her parents, Ernie and Angela Williamson, who had 4 children, Casey being the second oldest. And eventually the two would separate after having marital issues, and Angela would take the children to live in Valley Park, Missouri, where they'd end up living at their grandfather's home on Benton Street. And Ernie actually ended up being really lucky because he was able to rent at their friend Michelle and her boyfriend Ernie's home, which ended up being right across the street from Angela's grandfather's home, meaning that the kids would end up being really close to their parents because their parents lived right across the street from each other, so it wasn't like they would have to go far if they wanted to visit the other parent. And it seemed that they had a really good custody situation going on. The kids would go across the street very frequently, if not every day. They were still seeing both of their parents, and honestly seems like an ideal situation. By 2002, Casey was now 6 years old and described as a vibrant, energetic kid who was smart. She was happy and had an infectious smile. She frequented youth activities at the local church and was a huge Britney Spears fan, which I feel like every little girl in the early 2000s was. I was as well. Casey was in kindergarten at Valley Park Elementary School, and she loved riding bikes and singing. That summer, on July 24th, 24-year-old Johnny Johnson would end up going over to Michelle's home looking for Eddie and Ernie. That day, Casey's sister Chelsea and her friend Angel were riding their bikes up and down Benton Street when they realized that Johnny Johnson was following them. So they ended up speeding up their bikes and returning home, having a weird feeling. It would turn out that Casey's mother Angela actually was really close with Johnny and his family. She was actually best friends with Johnny's sister, and she actually babysat Johnny when he was a kid. So Johnny was no stranger to the Williamsons family, and he actually occasionally crashed on their couch. However, Johnny had quite a troubled past. Johnny Johnson was born on March 16th of 1978 in Missouri. Him and his 3 siblings were mainly raised by his mother after Johnny's father ended up walking out when he was around 2 years old. So his family was a struggling family trying to live in Valley Park. His mother was a single mother trying to raise 4 children alone, and she was also working as a nurse's aide at a local nursing home. And Johnny would experience quite a bit of loss and tragedy in his childhood. It was said that his father died of diabetes complications in 1999, and then his grandfather actually had a heart attack and died in front of Johnny. All of this led to Johnny experiencing a lot of depression and mental health issues from a very young age, but it's not an excuse for what he would end up doing. Growing up, Johnny was known as a moody loner who was nicknamed Pee-wee due to his small size. He would actually eventually, though, get the name tattooed on his stomach. And as a teenager, Johnny continued to struggle. He eventually would begin to cut himself, twice to the point of requiring medical attention. In 1997, at the age of 19, Johnny would end up being arrested on theft and burglary charges and end up being sentenced to 3 years of probation. Only a year later, he'd end up stealing an ATV along with firearms from a home in Kirkwood, and this time be charged with theft, stealing a firearm, along with another burglary charge. He'd be sentenced to 7 years in prison. But get this, he was let out after only 4 months on good behavior. From 7 years to 4 months, which is insane to me. And if he had still been in prison and not been let out, Casey might not have died. Clearly, he did not learn any lessons from going to prison and getting a second chance after only 4 months, because while still on probation, Johnny would catch paraphernalia charges, alcohol by a minor charges, destruction of property charges. He was just continuously racking up charges. And did he get put back in jail for violating his probation? No. Instead, he was free as long as he followed up with a probation officer. At this point, Johnny was living with his sister and caring for her children, which, when you find out what he will eventually do and the thoughts he was having, I fear for those children, and I really hope that he didn't do anything to them. But around this time, Johnny would end up meeting a woman. He'd fall in love with her. She'd get pregnant. And in December of 1999, she would give birth to their son. And according to the mother of Johnny's child, at this time, Johnny was really good with children. He was extremely happy, and he just wanted to be a good person for his son. And things seemed to be going great in Johnny's life for once. until they weren't again. October of 2001, Johnny would once again violate his probation, but this time he was ordered to be confined at the St. Louis Psychiatric Rehabilitation Center in St. Louis. And this is where Johnny would first be diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, it would be determined some way, somehow, that Johnny was not a threat to himself or others. So on January 9th of 2002, Johnny would be released. And he was released without conditions. There was a plan of sorts in place, however, where Johnny needed to live with his grandmother. He needed to continue appointments with his doctors, complete a drug and alcohol abuse program, and so on. And as usual, at first Johnny was doing really good with everything, but soon after he'd stop progressing and eventually start falling back on his responsibilities. And as summer approached, Johnny was failing to meet with his probation officers. He was spending most of his time out drinking and partying in Valley Park, and he was just sleeping on random people's couches. His relationship with his girlfriend was also going downhill now because he was never present at home. He was never spending time there. He was always out partying and not spending time at home with her and their son. You know, going back to work, getting a job, building up their life together. He wasn't doing any of that. So unsurprisingly, they were fighting a lot, and Johnny was never really present at home at this point. Johnny's family tried to warn him that if he didn't get his act together, he was going to end up going back to jail, but they were not prepared for how bad things were about to get. So on the evening of July 4th, Johnny would end up crashing on Michelle's couch, and Angela would actually end up bringing the kids over so that they could spend time with their father. The next morning, on July 25th, Angela would end up waking up in the morning to find Casey sitting on the couch watching cartoons with Johnny. Again, Angela wouldn't have really found this odd because she'd known Johnny pretty much his entire life. She babysat him as a kid. She watched him grow up. She was best friends with his sister. It wouldn't really be odd to wake up and find, you know, a family friend hanging out in your house with how close everyone was there. And Johnny would end up telling Angela that Casey wasn't bothering him. You know, they were just sitting there watching cartoons. But unbeknownst to Angela, this was the moment when Johnny would begin thinking that little 6-year-old Casey was cute, and he began fantasizing about essaying her. During the day, Angela would end up taking all the kids back over to Michelle's house, and all the kids were over there playing for the majority of the day, including some other friends, including Angel, which was Chelsea's friend I spoke about earlier. Angel would end up recounting noticing that Johnny was actually sitting on the back deck of the house that day, and she would end up going and locking the door. And I want to assume that's because she didn't feel safe or she had a bad feeling that there was something weird going on. And she would later say that she would hear knocking on the door, but she never went and unlocked it. Later that night, there was a barbecue at Michelle's house, and everyone ended up attending, including Johnny. Again, the children and Johnny spent the night at Michelle's home. On the morning of July 26, 2002, Ernie would end up waking up around 6 a.m. to get ready for work. Casey would end up also waking up around this time, and she would end up telling her father that she was hungry. So Ernie told her to wait upstairs while he got ready for work, and then he would take her over to her grandfather's house so that she could have some breakfast. When Ernie went downstairs, he noticed that Johnny was asleep on the couch, and that's when he went into the bathroom and began getting ready for work. But when he came out of that bathroom, Casey was nowhere to be found, and neither was Johnny. Ernie and Angela would immediately end up reporting Casey missing, but I couldn't find an exact timestamp of the time of when they did that. And they would end up informing police that Johnny was mysteriously missing as well. Nearly 100 people, including the St. Louis County Police, FBI, and volunteers spent the next few hours searching the woods along the Merrimack River for Casey. Neighbors would end up reporting that they had seen Johnny carrying Casey down the street, and she was only wearing her nightgown. Soon after, 2 county police officers would end up locating Johnny, and he was soaking wet, walking down a street near Benton, as if nothing was wrong. He would be immediately arrested and taken into custody. However, Johnny was denying having anything to do with Casey's disappearance. Around 3 p.m. that day, the search for Casey would end up being called off, and all of the volunteers were asked to leave the woods. It would turn out that a volunteer who was searching only a mile away at the site of the old St. Louis plate glass company would end up finding the body of 6-year-old Casey in a pit, and she was buried beneath debris and large rocks. Now, around this time, Johnny began to change his tune, and he started to say that Casey had died in an accident and that he had covered it up and that he had buried her, claiming that it was actually Casey who wanted to go to the glass factory with him, and that when they were climbing down into the pit, a rock had fallen on her, hitting Casey in the head and killing her. He then said he freaked out because he didn't think anyone was going to believe him. However, investigators would determine that Casey had died from blunt force trauma, and they were not buying Johnny's story. The officers also went as far to ask Johnny how he would feel if it was his son that was missing, and that actually really pissed Johnny off, which is ironic considering he clearly didn't care for the life of another child. And from there, the grisly truth would come out.
And when he came out of the bathroom, she was gone. And we can't find her.
A mother's heartbreak turns to devastation Friday afternoon as her daughter, 6-year-old Casey Williamson, is found dead just miles from the family home.
The whole family's gathered around her, and she cried in my arms for a long time, and her mother's with her.
Neighbors rushed to the family home with flowers, teddy bears, and words of support. They had spent hours scouring the area for the 6-year-old. Now they only have memories.
Just a sweet little girl, just one of the other kids that ran around the neighborhood.
Investigators say Casey's body was found covered in debris in the old glassworks factory, a known hangout for drug users. The suspect, 24-year-old Johnny Johnson, allegedly confessed to police. Investigators won't say how the little girl died. Johnson has a minor arrest record. Now he's facing an accusation of murder.
The sad conclusion, but now we're going to work hard to gather the evidence to hopefully put him in jail and maybe even a death penalty, which he probably deserves if he did in fact do this.
Oh, I recognize him.
Valley Park residents James and Alice Schwartz were horrified when they heard of Johnson's arrest. They knew his family years ago. They say the young man had a strange demeanor.
You're a hard man to talk to. He acted like he didn't half understand what you were saying, and he was unresponsive. He's not a conversationalist.
Casey's grandfather tells me he's hoping for justice, but he knows it won't bring Casey back, and he has only memories of his little girl.
She loved riding her bicycle. She loved to sing. She could sing.
Now I'm going to tell you what happened to Casey according to Johnny. And it seems that the police do believe that this is the truth. And honestly, with how detailed and disturbing all of this information is, I kind of believe it too. So be prepared because the details are absolutely horrific, but I think it's important to understand how truly evil Johnny Johnson was. On the morning of July 26th, Johnny Johnson would wake up to find 6-year-old Casey standing next to his couch watching cartoons. She was alone with him, and he knew what he was about to do. He planned it in his mind, and he now had the perfect opportunity to execute his plan. Casey was only wearing a nightgown and her underwear when 24-year-old Johnny Johnson ended up asking her if she wanted to go down to the old glass factory to play. Casey was excited. This is someone she thought she could trust. And so the two of them left Michelle's home, heading down the street. As the two headed down Benton Street and then an alley, Casey began to complain that her feet were hurting, because again, she had no shoes on. She was walking along this road and down an alleyway barefoot. So Johnny ended up picking her up and carrying her, which is what some of the neighbors seen. When they came to the woods leading to the glass factory, they ended up walking down a path to a sunken pit with bricks and concrete walls more than 6 feet high. Casey and Johnny then crawled through a small tunnel and dropped into the pit where Johnny was prepared to execute his sick plan. The first thing Johnny did was ask little Casey if she wanted to see his you-know-what. She said no, and he still decided to pull down his pants and expose himself to her. He then asked Casey to pull down her panties so that he could see her private parts, which she again said no to, so Johnny then ripped them off of her. He then forced Casey to the ground, pinning her down by her chest, and began rubbing himself on her leg in an attempt to get an erection. However, Casey was a fighter, and she began to scream, punch, kick, push at Johnny, and in the process, she ended up scratching his chest. Now at this point, Johnny thankfully had not essayed Casey, but he got up and he decided to just skip that part at this point, and he was going straight to killing her. And he had planned to kill her this entire time after he had essayed her because he didn't want her to tell on him. So Johnny ended up picking up a brick from the floor of the pit and hit Casey in the head 6 times, bruising Casey's head, and she began to bleed. But as I said, Casey was a fighter, and she, by some miracle, was not unconscious or dead yet, which I can't imagine after being hit in the head 6 times with a brick. And this is when Casey began to run around the pit in circles, trying to find a way out of there, but the walls were 6 feet high, and there was no way a little 6-year-old was gonna crawl out of that pit, which I feel like Johnny planned that. She was essentially stuck, and she had nowhere to go. Johnny would end up catching Casey and began to hit her again in the head with the brick. At this point, she fell to her knees and continued to try to fight for her life, trying to crawl away from Johnny with every ounce of strength that was left in her. Johnny again struck Casey with the brick, this time knocking her to the ground and fracturing the right side of her skull. Because Casey was still somehow moving at this point, still fighting for her life, Johnny then grabbed a basketball-sized boulder and dropped it down on the left side of Casey's skull and neck, causing multiple skull fractures. According to Johnny, Casey then inhaled and exhaled really fast and then stopped breathing altogether. Johnny then took Casey's underwear and wiped some blood from her face and then threw those underwear in a hole in the wall. He then buried Casey with rocks, debris, leaves from the pit before climbing out and heading for the Merrimack River, where he then washed the blood off himself and as much evidence as he could. And that's why police would end up finding Johnny Johnson walking down the street soaking wet with no care in the world, as if he hadn't just attempted to essay and then brutally murder a 6-year-old girl, the daughter of one of his friends that he'd known his whole life. And we know what happened after that. 24-year-old Johnny Johnson would be arrested and charged with the murder and attempted essay of 6-year-old Casey. At Johnny's trial, his lawyer tried to explain that although he was an ex-con who had just gotten out of a state psychiatric facility 6 months prior, he had stopped taking his medication, and that's what caused him to act the way he did. However, no one bought that, thankfully, or had any remorse for Johnny, and he was sentenced to death. In prison, Johnny would end up saying some wild things, including that he was a vampire and that the devil would end the world if he was killed. As Johnny's execution loomed, they would begin appealing it, citing his mental illness, and his defense attorney would again begin to cite and argue that Johnny had stopped taking his schizophrenia medication 6 months before he killed Casey. Thankfully, in June of 2003, the Missouri Supreme Court denied his appeal. They argued that Johnny should not be executed due to schizophrenia, preventing him from understanding the link between his crime and his punishment. Johnny Johnson's last meal was a burger, curly fries, and a strawberry milkshake. Unlike little 6-year-old Casey, who didn't even get to have breakfast that day because Johnny decided to attempt to essay her and murder her. And at 45 years old, Johnny Johnson would officially be executed with a lethal injection dose of pentobarbital in a state prison in Bonne Terre. He was pronounced dead at 6:33 p.m. In a handwritten statement, Johnny would say, and I quote, "God bless, sorry to the people and family I hurt," end quote. Prosecutor Bob McCulloch said that although Johnny had significant issues such as schizophrenia, he knew what he was doing when he killed Casey, and he... What do you all think of this one? I know the death sentence is a heavily debated topic, and I would like to know how you all feel about that, but I think this is a good example of a case where the death sentence is appropriate. I think if you know 100% that someone did something as brutal and horrific as Johnny Johnson did, there are obviously examples where people are wrongfully convicted. And I think if there's some kind of question if someone did it, I don't think that they should be put on death row. But I think in a case like Johnny's where he confessed to it, you know 100% there is no one else that did it and that it was specifically that person, I think there's not really much of an argument there. But I do really want to know how you all feel. I think if there's ever an example of someone that deserved it, it is Johnny Johnson. Considering the horrendous way that Johnny killed Casey, her last moments of terror, knowing that he had pre-planned all of this and that he knew he was going to kill her even after he essayed her, honestly, I say good riddance. But I do think mental health is an interesting thing to consider. However, not everyone with schizophrenia wants to murder people. And I think that gives people with schizophrenia a really bad rap when there are people that have it to do things like this, because I have seen people who are YouTubers that have schizophrenia, and I don't think in a million years they would ever think that they would want to essay and murder a 6-year-old girl. And considering Johnny Johnson had a criminal history beforehand, I think he was just someone who was really screwed up, and the schizophrenia probably made it worse. He was probably just a very mentally sick individual who was a pedophile, and the schizophrenia allowed him to and helped him to act on his impulses. But what do you all think? I think Casey's story is a good example that brings up the question of who you allow around your children, especially unattended. You never know what someone is feeling or thinking inside, whether that be friend or family. And I think we should all be more aware of situations like that. And I am by no means blaming Casey's parents. They had no way of knowing that this would have happened to Casey. Again, they knew Johnny pretty much his entire life. He had been around their family and the kids for years and years and years, and nothing had ever happened. But I think this is something that's really important to reflect on, who you allow your children around, so something like this doesn't happen to another child. So let's have a conversation below. If you have any other cases that you want me to cover and look into, let me know as well down below, and I will do my best to look into them. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I will see you in the next video.